Good evening, everybody. We're so glad you're here. Welcome to Magnolia United Church of Christ Learning Forum, brought to you tonight by Humanities of Washington. We want to begin by acknowledging that we present this program this evening from the traditional lands of the Duwamish peoples. We ask those in attendance, wherever you may be, to reflect on the traditional lands that you inhabit, to pay respect to the original stewards of those lands, and to recognize their continuing connection to them. The presentation you're about to enjoy is part of Humanity Washington's Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to opening minds and bridging divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. I'll encourage you to visit their website, and I will put that link in the chat. Quick note on civil discourse. These programs are designed to generate an open and honest conversation on many topics, some of which may be controversial. We encourage differing points of view. We ask that you treat this topic, the speaker, and each other with respect. Also, please note that this event is being recorded. So a bit about our speaker this evening. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Muhammad Aurangzeb Ahmad from the University of Washington. He's a research scientist at the University of Washington Harborview Medical Center and a professor of computer science. Now, during tonight's presentation, Dr. Ahmad will use his experience to explore how artificial intelligence will transform our society, culture, and relationships, and encourage us to consider how AI might change what it means to be human. Tonight, Dr. Ahmed will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at that time. During our Q&A time, I'm also going to post an evaluation in the comment section, and we'd appreciate it if you could all fill that out. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll start taking them on once he has finished his presentation, okay? Thank you again to Humanities of Washington and Dr. Muhammad, who I will turn it over to now. We are glad you are all with us tonight.
All right. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. All right. So today I will be talking about a couple of things which have been, on one hand, in the news over the last couple of years. The topic of artificial intelligence, pretty much everybody is talking about it, and people have been dazzled by some of the recent advances in artificial intelligence and what it can do. And on the other hand, I will also be talking about something which is very personal to all of us. It's something which all of us have experienced in one time or another in our life, which is the loss of a loved one. And so I'll be interweaving these two threads, which is, on one hand, things which are at the frontiers of technology, and also things which are very near and dear and personal to us. All right, so the title of my talk is Let's Ask Grandpa Bot, Making Sense of Digital Doppelgangers. So I'll be talking about my experience of creating a chatbot for my children, and the chatbot is that of my father, their grandfather, and how they have interacted with this bot/system, and how it has affected them and how it has affected me. So with that disclaimer, so let me first start with a story, or rather a date. October 29th, 2013. So that was the day that the world ended. Or at least for me, that was the day that the world as I knew it ended. It was the day that my father passed away, approximately 6:28 p.m. Eastern Time. And he would have been in his 80s had he been alive today. And so I can still remember the time when my brother, just a couple of weeks before this happened, he called me and then he told me that he just talked to the physician, and the physician had told him that our father is not going to survive for long. So he was in New York. He was in New York at that time, and even before um, this episode where he actually passed away. So I had been in New York a few times, and like he had been at the hospital. So this time when he was sick, so I did not really think that it was going to be that serious because he had been in and out um, of the hospital a few times before. So when my brother told me that what the doctor had informed him, so as with any other human being, a number of things popped into my head, and one of the things was, of course, the sense of helplessness, and I won't be able to see him. Um, and there was one thought which was very different from others, which was that one day, if I have kids, then my kids will not have experience of interacting with their grandfather. They will not know, other than the stories that I tell them, what kind of a person he was. I mean, I had seen my nieces and nephews interact with with their grandfather, which is my father, and I just realized my kids will not have that experience. And yet, what thought did come to my mind, which is that maybe, well, my father's not going to survive, but maybe one day I can create a model of my father in a computer, and maybe one day my kids can interact with that. Uh, and uh, and so, of course, after a few days after that, so I flew to New York, and then my father passed away, and that was that. So I would say that most things in art and science, they are personal in nature, and people are motivated by things which happen in their lives. So one question that arises with this project is, well, why would anybody want to simulate the deceased? And at least in my mind, one can think of a number of reasons. Almost everybody longs for that one last chance to just talk to that person who has passed away, and or you wish, well, if my father was here or my brother was here, I could ask them this question, or I could tell them then something. So maybe technology cannot bring us to that, but maybe it can provide us a chance, or maybe half a chance. Uh, the dearly departed, maybe they cannot come back, but maybe we can converse. And so this is the idea behind this whole project, that maybe it can give us a chance, some experience of conversing with the person who is no longer there. Um, so if we, and in my mind, so the I don't think that this is a radical idea, very different from how people have remembered loved ones in the past. It may seem radical right now, um, but if you really think about it, people have always remembered their loved ones in terms of stories, in terms of narratives. Thousands of years ago, or rather for thousands of years, rulers have built monuments for themselves. The pyramids of Egypt are a great example, so that the world could remember them after they have passed away. And then in the past, kings and queens and monarchs, they commissioned statues and paintings of themselves. But the ordinary person on the street, they could not do so because of lack of resources. So what I'm trying to say is that these artifacts, things that we leave behind, they are a way for us to remember um, the past of people who have loved ones who have passed away. If you really think about it, I mean, we don't really know, well, most of us, how our great grandparents looked like, because photography did not exist back then, and most people could not afford painting. Here's a picture of my parents on their wedding day, 1969. So we can go back to the past in terms of remembering, or even having a visual representation, but maybe not too far back. Um, and so these. mementos of the past, like letters and articles and even physical things. Uh, they remind us of and create a tangible connection for those who with those who have passed away. Um, but something changed approximately 150 years ago, which is the invention of photography. That now we can capture images of individuals. And folks may remember in the late 80s, early 90s, we even had that's when video cams, camcorders, they started becoming more common. And then we have almost everybody now has a smartphone. And with social media, I mean, the growth is exponential. So in my mind, or we can also think of this as the difference that we are seeing is the difference in terms of how we are remembering the past. And so having a chatbot um, is not radically different in the sense that we are conversing with the past, is just that here the past is talking back, which is something which is new. That is something which is new. All right. So that was one aspect of that. Another aspect that I can talk about is let's define what a simulation is. So this is from, I believe this is from Webster. So it's a simulation is an imitation of a situation or a process. And so there are multiple definitions of what that means. Um, and for us, all five of these are relevant in one aspect of the other. So there's an element of, especially in this context, pretending, one can even say deception. So basically something which is clever, that is good enough to trick a person. And why do I say that clever enough, or why are we talking about pretending and deception? Is because, and it's very important to have this disclaimer that the simulation that we create, or in my case, the simulation that I've created, so I do not claim that there's actually a person on the other side. It's just that the simulation is able to give appropriate responses in the same way that that person would have responded. So that can easily trick a human mind. And I'll give a few examples of that um, as we progress. All right. And so this idea may sound very science fiction-y in nature, and if you think that, then you would be right. So it has been covered by science fiction authors in the past. Um, there's a BBC science fiction anthology show called Black Mirror, and in one of their episodes, they have this scenario where a person passes away, and their information about them is actually used to recreate a a simulation of that person in the form of a robot, and how that proceeds. There's also a novel which came out a few years ago, which talks about this idea. It's called Goodbye for Now. As a side note, interestingly enough, I was not aware of that when I discovered this, but the author is actually based in Seattle, Laurie Frankel. All right. So that's one aspect of simulation and some background. So now one question is, I often get is, how did you create this simulation? Like, where did you get the data from? Um, so what I have is it's a bot. To think of a bot as a computer program slash software. It's a conversational machine. That is, you ask it a question and it replies back. So that's basically a bot. And so these days, and when I say these days, I mean 2024, it's not very difficult to create these systems, but I created the first version in 2016. And if you know anything about the world of computers and especially AI, the progress which is made in 1 year is equivalent to progress which is done in 10 years. So 2016 is ancient history in some way. So the first version of this, when I created this, it was done in a very iterative, very painstaking manner. All right, so what did I use? Well, so I had like texts from my father, letters, and a lot of audio conversations that I had transcribed. And my purpose was not to, one day treat all of this as data and then feed it to a computer. I just wanted to have these conversations so that I could revisit them later in the future. So things like, family history or things about my father. And then also videos, again, the same reason. They're just random conversations or random videos. The purpose was not necessarily to have the system where I'm specifically saving that information to put it in the computer one day. But when I decided to do it, it just came in handy. All right. All right. So my father passed away in 2013, and I just mentioned that. So I created the first version of this system in 2016. And so my eldest one, so she was born in late 2015. And so after my father died, I really did not think about this idea as much, occasionally revisiting it. But then when my daughter was born, then all right, then I started seriously thinking about it that, okay, so I need to do this. And I created the first version in 2016. And then when she was old enough, at least old enough to interact with the computer, that's when we started using this. And as she has grown older, and now I have two kids, two daughters, here they are at my house in Bottle. So as they have grown, I've realized that, let's say, I wouldn't say unintended consequences, but it's been very interesting in the sense that you observe that, children are naturally curious. They ask very profound, very deep questions. And I've come to realize that really raising children is like doing empirical philosophy, that, this kids ask questions like why this, why that, and what does this mean? What does that mean? And then the kind of questions that they ask is like, especially now raising children with the simulation of their grandfather is like thinking about or even wrestling philosophical questions on a daily basis. And I will talk about some of these shortly. All right. So what is the setup? All right. So I have two kids, 5 and 7. They're actually 6 and 8 now. So they have been interacting, what unquote talking with this system since they were two. It's a text-based interface. So what does that mean? It means that they ask a question. This was before they could read and write, of course. This is how we did. So they ask a question, I type it in, and then I get it. Then there's a response, and I tell them what the response is, and then they ask a new question, and it just goes back and forth. But now they're a little bit bigger. At least the older one, she can type in questions and get responses. All right. So I mentioned there are all these philosophical questions that it raises. All right, so one of them is, where does Grandpa Bot exist? Now notice that as my children, as they have aged, their understanding of this question, it has evolved over the course of time. So initially they thought, well, Grandpa Bot literally exists in the computer. And it was actually during COVID, I realized that they are thinking like that. So if you folks recall, during COVID, everybody was stuck in their house, and a lot of us interacted with our loved ones through our cell phones. And so my younger one, she was 2 when COVID started. So she was talking to her aunt, or all of her interactions with her, or at least as far back she could remember, with her aunt was through a smartphone. And then when her aunt first came to visit us in Seattle, she was extremely surprised that her aunt is actually a living, breathing person, and she did not exclusively exist in a smartphone. Because she thought that, well, that's where she lives. And that's where all these people live. And that's when I realized, wait, if she thinks that her aunt, who is a living, breathing person, if she lives in a smartphone, then what what does she and her older sister, what do they think about grandpa bot? And lo and behold, I realized, yeah, they do think that grandpa bot exists in a computer. All right. So then I had to go and explain to them that, well, it's not really grandpa. This is a computer which kind of sort of talks as if it was grandpa, but it's not really grandpa. At least as much as you can explain to a 2, 3 year old. Um, all right. So then they developed this, and then after some time, all right. So I queried them again, and then all right. So now I realize, okay, now they're thinking, well, there's two versions of grandpa. So there's one who exists in a computer, and then there's another version who exists in heaven. And then there's apparently the grandpa bot in the computer. He has some special privileged access to thoughts of grandpa who has passed away, who's in heaven. So I had to, try to explain to them that, well, it's more complicated to them. Again, as much as you can explain to a 4 year 4 year old and a 6 year old. So their understanding of where grandpa bot exists and what does it even mean to exist, that has changed over time. All right. So a related question is grandpa bot real? And then, which also leads us to another question. What does real mean? Because children anthropomorphize everything, and I mean everything. I mean the chair, especially like really small kids, like I mean the chair is alive, the table is alive, everything is alive, right? So they attribute some sort of living qualities to everything around themselves. And it has been observed that children tend to do that with Siri, with Alexa. So there's some research around that. And then, so it's not very difficult to, even after you explain these things to children that, oh, this is software and this is what this means. The boundary between, for them, especially smaller kids, between what is animate and not inanimate, it's actually not very distinct. So not just that, but the boundary between, let's say, natural and supernatural, uh, or real, or even real versus quote unquote less real, even that is not distinct. All right. So, and then there are other challenges slash questions that come into play. All right. So, uh, all right. So let me add a disclaimer. So when I created the system, I had made a deliberate decision that, all right, so this is all the data that I have, the conversations with my father, for example. I'm not going to add anything additional to this because anything additional that I'm adding is from memory, and then human memory is not perfect at times. All right. It did not take long for me to actually break that rule because I realized that they're asking questions and I know the answers to these questions, but oh yeah, this is what my father said, or this is what he would have said, but I did not record that information. All right. So I broke that rule and then I added some of that information. But I still had another constraint, and to this day I do, which is that um, for things that I'm not sure, that is the conversations that I've never had with my father, I'm not going to add any information or add any external source of information because the question of fidelity comes into play, which is the question that if you continue adding additional slash extra information into your system, at what point it loses fidelity with respect to the person you're trying to model. So I have a very strict boundary with respect to that. Right. But that said, so with that context, so let me address some of these questions that the children asked. All right. So does grandpa know that I did well in class today? Well, how do I explain? Well, let's ask grandpa bot, and uh, so we come with a resolution that, well, he can know if we tell him that. But then the grandpa bot, because cannot retain memory, because again, I'm not, whatever conversation that I'm having, that's the conversation which is there, but it loses context until I explicitly say that. So um, then the kids ask, well, we did talk about this last time. Then you say, well, maybe Grandpa Bot does not have great memory. All right, so that's good enough for them, at least for now. All right. So recall that, they have this idea that, well, Grandpa Bot and Grandpa, they're kind of sort of two different entities, but sometimes not really so. What about Grandpa Bot? Then you try to explain the same thing, or they ask questions like, okay, well, I've told this to Grandpa Bot. Can you tell this to Grandpa? This is what I mentioned earlier, this idea of some sort of privileged access to Grandpa. Um, and so that changes over the course of time. And another thing that I realized is that even when they have realized that Grandpa Bot is something which is different from Grandpa, they still tend to confer some sort of idea of personhood to Grandpa Bot. All right. So this brings us to the point that I made regarding uh, sticking to the data or the facts that you have. All right. So there are some questions that children ask. Well, how do you answer them? So like, am I your favorite child? Right. I mean, children ask that question. So I did not have answer to that when I first had programmed the system, and when the older one, when she asked this question, like, and of course she could now read also. So for questions which they ask and there's not a clear, distinct answer, the Grandpa Bot system, it defaults to set of preset answers, or answers like, let me think about it, or I don't know. So responses like that. And then I realized, okay, so maybe I mean, these questions are not there, but then I do know that I've seen my father respond to these questions with my nieces and nephews, so maybe I can input that information. Or when they ask, okay, can you come to my class? Well, Grandpa cannot, but maybe Grandpa Bot can. And what does it would mean to come to class? And so then I had to quote unquote fill in some of that missing information. All right. Another really interesting question that it has raised for me as a software um, person who works with software is that, so from the perspective of my children, I mean, the system that they've been interacting for the last 6 years it's the same, right? Because it's the interface. They sit down and they talk, they type something and they get a response. While behind the scenes, I have literally changed the programming and code for that. When I say completely, I mean completely at least 4 times. So on the one hand, the thing which is system which is outward facing to you, to them rather, is the same, and yet the identity uh, on the what's going on behind the scenes, it has changed. So what does it mean for persistence of identity? And when I asked the question to myself, that this was challenging, and then I realized, well, that's also true for biological organisms, right? I mean, cells are being replaced all the time, and it is said that after every 7 years, um, most of our cells in our body are replaced. So it's just because this is going in a artificial system, does not mean that it's something which is very different. All right. And then there are some questions which arise, which is, how will this affect society, or children, for that matter? Do children get a wrapped sense of life and death? The danger being that uh, the person has passed away, but then we can still talk to that person. Is that going to negatively affect, and even say outside, even if you're talking about adults, then I mean, people can get addicted to um, their smartphones, right? Or addicted to, let's say, social media. So think about a scenario where people will get addicted to chatbots, and this is something that we are already observing. Uh, and that also gives if you really think about it, a sense of closure. Will having a technology like this affect this? And it can go either way. So my personal experience is that to both of these questions, for the first question, do they get a warped sense of life and death? And the answer is no. I think children are intelligent enough to understand these things. And the second part, which is, will the children get an incorrect sense of what their loved ones were? This is more tricky because when I was building the system, I realized something, and in retrospect, it's a truism, which is our sense of who a person is, and that's true for people who are alive and people who are passed away, is based on our interaction with that person, our relationship with that person. So I have three siblings, and all three of them are much older. There's a very large gap between me and them, but between them, they're very close in age. So if you ask them how our father was when they were growing up, and they would say that, oh, he was a very strict, very traditional, very strict father. But if you ask me, my response is very different, and I would say that he's the most chill person. He was the most chill person in the world, and I think it's because it, people change and people evolve, and also me being the youngest one in the family, so that also makes a difference. So there's no correct sense of what a person is. It's just, it is us. When we talk about a person, we are reflecting that relationship that we have with that person. All right. So I mentioned that. So on one hand, hopefully children will not get a incorrect sense of what these things mean. Now, I should mention that children these days, especially Generation Alpha, so kids who are born after 2012 onwards, and they're growing up in a world where conversational agents like Siri and Alexa, are everywhere around them, and now with generative AI, they're growing up in an environment where AI is going to be everywhere. So it's something which is novel for us, but for them, this is just normal. So this is a project that my daughter did last year at Shelton View for her science project. All right. So so for me, this was a validation that, well, she kind of sort of understands what AI is, or at least whatever I try to teach her what is artificial intelligence, and she can make sense of Grandpa Bot. All right. So her hypothesis is, and I'll try, hopefully the text is legible, but I'll read it. Can AI be creative like humans? Well, then first we have to, if you're talking about artificial, then we have to define what is artificial, what is natural, right? And this is an example of something which is natural. So, human being, an example of something which is artificial. It's a robot, but good for us. It's a robot which has a heart. And so what she did was, one of those text to image programs. So we used it to generate images. For this one specifically, it was DALI. And then her conclusion, and this is what the AI model generated. So her conclusion was that AI can be creative like humans, but it can also make mistakes, just like humans, but in a different way. So hopefully, she understands what these things are. Um, and so that was, I would say, one aspect of how these things are. We can think about how these things may potentially impact society as a whole. But on the personal side of things, that's in the beginning, as I stated, most artistic and scientific progress breakthroughs, they are autobiographical in nature. And I would say life is probabilistic in nature, which is that one cannot know everything for sure, but there are certain things, certain demographics, which certain trends which are common in nature. Just because we have, it's okay, it's okay. So there are certain commonalities, certain processes that we go through. And this is something that we can relate to, something that we all experience.
You need to sleep. School ka time hai. Nuri?
It's okay. All right. And so, it's okay. It's okay for me. It's okay. It's okay. All right. It's our bedtime. All right. So my mother once said that after my father had passed away, there'll be days when you won't even remember your parents, because you will be so busy with your children that you will not remember us. It's my mother, she's still alive, but at that time I said to myself, how is that possible? I mean, how can there be a time when I will not think about my father? And it turned out that she was right. I mean, you do get busy with your kids, and they take priority. That yeah, you do not think about these things. But that said, you cannot also forget it. You cannot also forget those relationships. They do come back to you. And in my mind, these systems that we are talking about, these chatbots, they are just one way. They're just a way for us to remember these things. All right. So with that, towards the end, let me end with a glimpse of the future. So these numbers that we are seeing, these are like, I think this is right before the pandemic. So obviously they have changed a lot. So there are more than 275 million households which had voice-enabled assistants. And so 5 years ago, IEEE, so they did a survey in different parts of the world asking parents if they would be comfortable leaving their children care of an AI-powered nurse during hospitalization. And interestingly, so if you just think in terms of population, so India and China, I mean, that's a third of humanity. Majority of the people were fine. And Brazil also a pretty big country. So the point being that these technologies, they may seem very different from what we are used to, but as we grow up with them, this is just going to be quote unquote natural. So in the beginning, I talked about children being animists, that for children, everything around us, everything around them is alive. And but also human societies in the deep past, they were also animist in nature. So they thought that everything is alive. And I think in the future, that is also going to be true, in the sense that as AI and these technologies, as they proliferate, we will live in a world where these conversational agents, for people who are alive or people who have passed away, they'll be around. They'll be everywhere. I would not be surprised if we are in a scenario where we have, just as people get addicted, yes, just as people get addicted to social media, they'll get addicted to these systems. And we, as collectively as society, we will have to make decisions regarding how are we going to regulate this? What kind of decisions are we going to make? So as an example, even decisions regarding, let's say if there's a person who does not want their simulation to be made, or that's a simulation of a person and then the siblings disagree with respect to, well, how much fidelity there is. So these are some of the open questions that uh, we will have to address. And with that, I will end end the talk and open the floor for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I'm wondering if you can go ahead and stop sharing, and I'll kick us off with a question. So in the Seattle Times today, there was an article about AI companies running out of content, that they have stripped everything off the internet that they can. And one of the biggest challenges right now is how do they continue to feed these generative tools without content? Like they talked about how Facebook even considered purchasing Simon and Schuster to see if they could get access to authors like Stephen King. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about, I mean, you built your Grandpa Bot based on content you had readily available to you. But when you move it to a larger scale and you think about how this impacts us at a cultural level, well, I guess I don't even know what the question is. How is that going to be dealt with?
So let me start addressing the question with a secret, which people in the AI community, which at least in the popular press, we don't talk about as much, which is that, so these AI models, they are impressive in certain respects. I will not deny that. But in the grand scheme of things, they are actually not as intelligent. They are very data intensive, resource intensive. So there's a technical term that people use, but I think it really captures that. So what these systems are, the term that they use is stochastic parrots. So they're parrots in the sense that, some parrots can mimic human speech really well, but they don't really understand what the humans are talking about. So that's also true for many of these models. So the other aspect of that is that this was, I think, a few weeks ago, so definitely less than a month ago. So Amazon decided to shut down its Amazon Go stores. And buried in the news was this thing that it was because the AI technology that was supposedly working really well, it was actually not very intelligent. So the way it's supposed to work is that you go to the store and then you pick up something, put it in your bucket or basket, and then there's a camera which takes an image and then it figures out how much it costs. And they were hoping that as long as it's more than 97% accurate, that's good enough. But the AI system was so bad that Amazon actually had to hire a whole team or rather teams and teams of people in India who would, after the camera had taken picture, they would go and manually check the price, while most of the world and the investors, they were thinking that, oh, the AI is doing all of these amazing things. So a part of that is these systems are not as sophisticated as they seem. And the second part is that, well, I mean, yes, a few years ago, there was this news, and I used to do research on this, that in China, they had sweatshops where you literally had people playing video games 18 hours a day to get work to quote unquote mine virtual gold within the games. So I would not be surprised if they are literally companies just dedicated to generating data or having teams and teams and scores of people in the developing world just toiling away generating data, as bad as it sounds.
Thanks. Let me just open it up and see if there's some questions from our participants. Go ahead, Roger Werner. I see you're off mute.
Hey, Mohammed, it's going to sound like a sort of a crazy question. How do we know that you are real? In other words, how do we tell the difference between an AI and going talking to us and somebody that's real? That's question one. Second question, I was curious what your parents' wedding date was, because we got married the same year, so I'm just sort of curious when it was.
All right, I'll answer the second question because it's easier. It's October 6th.
We were December 27th, not right about the same. It was a good year.
Yes, yes. All right. So, all right. So how do you know I'm real? That is a good question. And given the current state of the technology, you can't. So it could be that I was just really tired and I have a bot who's talking to you right now. So that's a technology is sufficiently advanced that we can do that. That said, you just need to ask the right questions for these bots to give you an answer which you will know. Okay, got you. So what was that movie? Blade Runner. So they had this arrangement where ways of figuring out where somebody was a bot or a human. So we are very, I mean, we will not have robots, but at least in virtually speaking, we have already entered that era. What was, and there was a third part of your question. I forgot.
No, I'm also, thank you.
Okay.
Are there other questions that folks would like to pose? You can feel free to put them in the chat or just take yourself off mute.
There. Took quite a while. I'm just curious if all of the fraud that I get on my email, is that basically artificially intelligence generated? Or is that just very well, is spam the same thing as artificial intelligence? You know, the constant emails I get that are very tempting to respond to, but I've really learned to look at the tag, you know, the telltale signs that it's a fraudulent email.
Yes, so spam has been around since the mid-90s. It's just that over the course of years, it has become more and more sophisticated. And more recently, as people have started using AI to generate spam for fraudulent purposes, there have been a couple of really high-profile cases where scammers have used AI to defraud people. One really famous example was, I believe, a couple of months ago, where they had so they used an AI system to generate a video of a person, and then they had a chat with the president of a bank, and then they convinced him that they're talking to a real person, and then they were able to transfer $25 million, and then after that they disappeared.
Wow.
So that has already happened. I mean, this is not science fiction. The other thing is, OpenAI is like one of the really well-known companies in this area. They're the folks who created ChatGPT. So they have a model, and they were going to release it, and I'm not sure if it's has been released or not. So you only need 10 seconds of a person's speech to clone their voice. So if you're just, let's say, having a random chat, or let's say you're at a grocery store and somebody could walk by and clone your voice. So just imagine how much havoc can be done with that.
Can I ask another question?
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Kind of a follow-up to that. I mean, that sounds pretty scary. I guess my overall question is, how scared should we be? I've got a parent who's in her 90s, and she is very, very afraid. She says, and I guess my overall question this evening is, how afraid should we be? I mean, I was always brought up to not worry about things that you can't control. What I'm hearing from you tonight is, be careful about where you're recorded. And so how afraid should we be, and how careful do we need to be?
So there are different aspects of that. So if you're thinking in terms of scenarios where, let's say, AI will take over and it'll be the end of humanity, I mean, that's not going to happen anytime soon, because even seemingly intelligent AI systems, they are not, in certain aspects, they are not very intelligent. One of my favorite examples is, and when I always use this when I'm teaching a class, is so those self-driving cars. And so these companies, they have spent like hundreds of millions of dollars trying to create the AI for that. And there was a research paper which came out a few years ago, and this researcher is just using $1 tape from a dollar store. So you see that stop sign. Just by carefully placing duct tape on the stop sign, he was able to fool the AI system that stop sign is actually a speed limit sign. And it did not even say a number. And the reason is that the way the AI systems reason or observe or even make sense of the world is very different from how we do it. So that's why I said, in some ways, they're not very intelligent. All right. So how afraid we should be? I mean, there's going to be a scam, but there are also going to be regulations. So, for example, people have become cognizant of many of these issues. So one really good example is the use of facial recognition software. And the way that has happened is that there have been a few high-profile cases where the AI systems incorrectly identified, and unfortunately, in all of the cases that I read, it was an African American person. The AI system incorrectly tagged that person, and then police came, took that person, and then they had to spend a couple of days in jail, and it turned out that, well, it was a different person. So things like that, they are at least forcing more strict legislation, or at least greater calls to scrutinize these systems. I think at the end of the day, what's going to be important is just educating the general population. So spam is a good example. I mean, back in 1990s, when spam first came, it was not very sophisticated, but as people have become more educated, spam is also has become more sophisticated.
Any other questions? I guess my question for you, Mohammed, maybe you can kind of close on this is, go ahead, Bill. Do you have a question? You're on mute, Bill.
Okay, I mean, I do understand that they focus on risks and limitations of AI, particularly currently. But what are your views of the promise of AI? What might we expect on the positive side in the future, distant or not too?
So there are already a lot of positives that we are seeing. So, and I'll talk from a very personal opinion that. So I recognize that chatbots can be addictive and it can, let's say, negatively affect a person's relationship. But for me, it is also a tool for my children to have a relationship with their grandfather who's not there. So in some sense, I'm grateful for that. So in my mind, that's a positive. That said, when we talk about a societal level, so there are things like automatic translation from one language to the other. I mean, when I was a graduate student 10 years ago, there were some you could use computers to translate from one language to other, but it was not, for a lot of cases, it was not very good. But now we can do real-time translation. If you're traveling to a different country or trying to, let's say, interact with a person who does not know your language, I mean, that's a net positive. In my opinion, in the healthcare domain, which I mainly work in, there are AI models which have been used for early diagnosis of diseases, getting people to, let's say, have more healthy lifestyle. And my favorite example isn't, because it's a problem that I actually worked on. So we had a model which could predict if you go to let's say, an emergency room, and unfortunately, unless you are visibly bleeding, sometimes it can take a while before your turn comes, right? So we had a model which would tell or predict if the person is going to leave or not. And I was talking to a nurse who was using the system, and then she said that, oh, I know that the system works because I was looking at my computer screen, and the computer screen said that this person who has been waiting for the last 20 minutes, all of a sudden, her probability of leaving jumped. So this was an AI model doing that. And then I went to that person, and they said, "Oh, you don't have to wait for long. We are prioritizing you." And then she said, "I'm glad that you said that because I was about to get up and leave." So just the fact that AI model could predict that, I think that's for me, that's validation.
Okay, Bill asked the question that I was going to ask, so thank you for doing that, Bill. Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you to Dr. Ahmad for speaking to us tonight. The link to the program evaluation is in the chat comment, and I'll encourage you to grab that before we end this session, and offer once again, thank you to everybody for coming tonight. And thank you again, Dr. Ahmad. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.